Lucy Mack Smith. She was more than just a nourishing mother. She was the only author that was present from the bright first chapters of early Mormonism to the dark closing pages in Nauvoo. Within days of crying out to God over the corpses of her martyred children, she engaged young Martha Corey to act as her scribe. They sat for hours as Lucy stared down into the stone-cold past. Less than 1 year after they began, 70-year-old Lucy, despite her lack of a formal education, obtained a copyright for her 300 pages of heretofore unknown text, teeming with literary and Semitic complexity. Yet, she never published it. Despite claiming it was for the benefit of all saints, her book was of critical importance to the few men carefully circling each other for control over the headless church. Mother Smith's memoir could make or break a future prophet, priest, or king. Where other historians quickly accepted her narrative and moved past, I stopped and dug deeper. I found serious issues that had been overlooked by everyone. The first was a ridiculous story of her husband losing money selling crystallized ginseng to China. Well, the timing for the deal was off by months, not allowing for the travel time by ships of the day. Plus the alleged payment in a chest of gold, that was not something the Chinese did. And the Chinese valued the chi of a whole root in the shape of a human body. Why bring up a story where her husband dug up human-shaped roots and chopped them up? Well, then I discovered that her long death scenes had relatives dying from the symptoms of poisoning, drinking rice water, the source of arsenic, through clenched teeth. And there were these long-winded death monologues that included words from old religious texts, one relative quoting St. John of the Cross and another being likened to the Puritan protester Anne Hutchinson, who was killed by Indians. Then Mother Lucy made many, many indirect references to specific locations and names, when she clearly remembered enough to explicitly state them. Was she hiding something? And that's when it hit me. This wasn't a book. It was a ransom note. If you understood the full context of Lucy's narrative, why, you could use it to quickly unravel the truth claims of every branch of Mormonism. Lucy's family had paid dearly, in blood, for the new religion. If she didn't receive some benefit, she'd ruin everything for everyone. Brigham Young knew exactly what had to happen. Lucy and Emma got the money and resources in Nauvoo they needed to survive in return for their silence. Everyone, including Brigham, got to keep their branch of Mormonism. But the world did not get the truth. Shortly after the deal was struck, the prophet James Strang took the saints that followed him north to become the pirate king of Beaver Island, where he performed many Joseph-like miracles. Sidney Rigdon took the few saints that followed him back east. Brigham Young, the Lion of the Lord, modern-day Moses, he took his saints to Salt Lake City, among them Martha Corey. He ordered what he thought was the only copy of Lucy's manuscript thrown into the memory hole of his archives, where he assumed it would be forgotten forever. Lucy and Emma and their family remained in Nauvoo. In 1852, the church finally decided it was time to be more open and honest. Salt Lake leaders announced they had lied for years. Polygamy, long denied and cast as a scandalous lie by unscrupulous anti- and ex-Mormons, the very issue that had resulted in the deaths of Joseph and Hyrum, was true, doctrinal, and from God. Another bombshell that changed the then standard narrative: Joseph had also been a polygamist. A series of essays by Orson Pratt was rushed into print, explaining things in lawyerly doublespeak. Many felt betrayed. Converts and entire congregations resigned. Missionary efforts, particularly in England, took a beating. Orson was called upon to again work his magic, like the time he had introduced the first vision narrative years after the church had formed. On his way east, Orson came across another copy of Lucy's book and obtained her permission to use it as he saw fit. In England, he heavily edited the work, removing many of her stories, adding things she hadn't included. He took the focus off her entire family to shine a spotlight only on Joseph, making it seem he had approved of the work. Without Brigham Young's knowledge or permission, Orson published the hybrid book in England and used it to resurrect the flagging missionary efforts. When Brigham found out, he was outraged and denounced the book as a tissue of lies. A public spat between Brigham and Orson resulted in rising sales of the book in Salt Lake. When Lucy died, Emma used her resources to help her son, Joseph Smith III, claim leadership of the scattered remnants of the Midwestern saints. The young prophet believed strongly two core tenets his mother had drilled into him since childhood. The first, his father was a good man. The second, who had never practiced polygamy. Young Joseph announced he was coming after Brigham to reclaim the lost saints in Utah. In response, Brigham pulled a Fahrenheit 451 and demanded Orson's version of Lucy's book be banned and all copies rounded up and destroyed. Why did Brigham Young see Lucy's book as a Pandora's box that he tried to close? His concerns should not have been dismissed. These stories certainly should have never been reprinted in a children's book. As I came to fully understand the context of the threat Brigham saw, I discovered hidden threads and buried treasures in Lucy's writing. As each mystery unraveled, I was reminded of the words Lucy spoke in General Conference in 1845. Are you willing to receive stolen goods or not? I want to know if you believe in such things. For the rest of my presentation, I have a lot of stories in limited time. I'll go quick, but if you miss anything or want more details, be sure to get my book. It's important to note that this is not the Spalding-Rigdon theory. That theory has so many moving parts and never really explains why Rigdon would need Joseph at all when he'd already written fake scriptures on his own. There are a few names that we do need to know. You can research them yourselves, and when you do, I'm pretty sure you'll have a greater understanding of how I can make the bold claim that the Lucy Code lays out the most plausible natural explanation for the way it went down. What she pointed to destroys the truth claims of every branch of Mormonism. Our first stop is the real ancient America. Like all other ancient Americans, the Aztecs never had horses, elephants, cows, goats, sheep, pigs, barley, wheat, bees, chariots, wheels, scimitars, or steel, but they did have cities, 200,000 strong, larger than most in Europe. They had technology, religion, government, modes of transportation, and their own form of currency. They also had sharp and lethal weapons made from volcanic obsidian glass. When Cortez showed up initially, the Aztecs had superior manpower, and they were every bit the equal of the Spaniards. The Spanish were driven off after they brutally slaughtered members of the royal family. They showed up a year later expecting a fight on their hands, not sure they would prevail. What they found instead was a ghost town. In the end, it was Spanish germs, not Spanish steel, that defeated the Aztecs. In addition to their cities and gold being looted, their religious artifacts, including religious mirrors that had allowed their priests to see the future in the heavens, were taken. The old world feasted on the stolen treasures of the new. 50 years later, Queen Elizabeth ruled England with the greatest scientist and magician in the world at her side. John Dee had used astrology to choose the Queen's coronation date. When a new star appeared in the heavens, people were scared. They thought the world was ending and Jesus was returning. As owner of the largest library on earth, Dee sought answers to this heavenly sign. With the later destruction of the Spanish Armada, Dee told the Queen that all of this was a message from God and that she was to be the next King Arthur with Dee, her Merlin. Dee had consulted a history text called the Scotichronicon, a multi-volume work written in Latin containing an earlier abridged history and the earliest references to Arthurian legends. Dee informed the Queen that this time Camelot would be a British empire spanning the globe. He created special instruments and charts, and the Queen selected Francis Drake to make Dee's prophecies reality. Dee next turned his sights on discovering the science behind God's hierarchy of angels. Everyone knew that the entire world was run by different levels of angels and that hidden mysteries would be revealed if you could talk with them. Dee was confident that his stone Aztec mirror was the key to heavenly communication. Ancient civilizations of the Hebrews, Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, and Aztecs contained lost knowledge that could help Dee, but all their priests and magicians were long dead. He again consulted the Scotichronicon for advice on how to proceed. There he read the legend of Skota, an Egyptian princess and a Greek prince who had joined forces, wandered in the desert for a bit, and then built ships and sailed west. Their descendants eventually became the first kings and queens of Ireland and Scotland, who kept their sun-worshipping religion. Magic stones were central to these beliefs. They had even brought the stone of scone with them, the very stone pillow the prophet Jacob had used when he'd received his famous vision. Jacob's ladder was the stairway to and from heaven that allowed God and angels to communicate with men. Dee knew Scottish Druids used magic hagstones as seer stones to find lost treasures and see into heavenly realms. If he couldn't find an actual Aztec or Egyptian magician to help him, maybe he could find the next best thing, someone descended from Irish or Scottish royalty who carried within their veins the blood and power of the lost Egyptians. Edward Kelly showed up with a forged genealogy claiming he was just the man Dee was looking for. As a convicted thief, Kelly's ears had been cut off, but this didn't stop Dee from giving him a trial run. Dee was delighted to discover that Edward could see into the stone. Ever the scientist, he documented their many sessions. Edward claimed that angels from the city of Enoch were communicating with him. These angels taught them the Enochian alphabet, so Kelly could read the parchment cartoon bubbles that showed up whenever they spoke. They learned the ancient Adamic language and were excited when the signet of Solomon was revealed. It contained magic symbols of a compass, square, horizontal mark, and navel line. These would eventually find their way into Freemasonry and Mormonism. If you've ever wondered about the real origins of your garments, now you know they came from Enochian angels communicating through cartoon bubbles in a stolen Aztec mirror to a convicted thief who used a fabricated genealogy to trick the Queen's magician into believing he was descended from Scottish royalty and, being Egyptian by blood, could work with magic stones. The signet also contained letters at the corners that, when read properly, said pay, lay, ale. Edward Kelly, despite being named by Dee as a prophet and seer, eventually grew bored and wanted to trick European royals into believing he knew how to turn lead into gold. To hasten the end of their work, Kelly revealed the final secret of the Enochian angels. The two men were to have all things in common, including wives. They convinced their spouses to go along with this, but when Dee's much younger wife got pregnant, the partnership ended. Dee returned to England and found his library and reputation destroyed. Kelly died from injuries sustained trying to escape a royal prison he'd been thrown into. John Dee's many deeds were written out of the history books, and other scientists learned well that when looking for ancient mysteries, it was best to keep secret anything you couldn't prove. John Dee's unwritten warning over 250 years before Mormonism was if you ever ran into a man who claimed to be a prophet and seer who could talk to the heavens by looking into a seer stone, well, you better keep a close eye on your wife. Starting in the Middle Ages, stonemason guilds sought to protect their wages by carefully controlling the workforce. Master and apprentice masons could travel to any castle or other project and prove their membership in the guild through a series of 4 special handshakes. Many felt Scottish and Irish masons were particularly skilled because of their claimed Egyptian lineage and that civilization's well-known stone projects, including the pyramids. In 1560, exiles from the murderous reign of the Protestant persecuting Queen Bloody Mary published the first mass-produced and easily readable English Bible. The Geneva Bible, dedicated to newly crowned Queen Elizabeth, was extremely popular with over 150 editions. It was the primary Bible of Protestant reformers and the Bible used by Shakespeare, Milton, Knox, and Bunyan. In 1611, King James shocked the world by producing his own Bible. It showed God ruling over a heaven of 3 degrees of the sun, moon, and stars. The controversial first edition included illustrations showing the union of Adam and Eve being solemnized by one of the secret stonemason handshakes. Parts of the text were starkly different. When Adam and Eve discovered their nakedness in the new Bible, they didn't cover themselves with pants, as in all prior Bibles. They covered themselves with masonic aprons. Further illustrations showed additional genealogies listed in the Bible being formed by that same masonic handshake. The different tribes of Israel were charted and connected to royal crests, showing how God favored the kings and queens of England. Even the King of Kings, Jesus Christ, was the product of a masonic union between Joseph and Mary. Not only was this blasphemous Bible rejected by the people, the monarchy was as well. In his youth, Oliver Cromwell had been a live-and-let-live Christian who followed the Dutch theologian Jacobus Arminius. He became a politician and then a failed farmer and suffered a nervous breakdown. He converted to stringent Puritanism. Ignoring the divine right of kings, he signed the execution order for the regicide of King Charles. He gained a reputation as a brutal theocratic dictator and earned the nickname God's Executioner. When he tried to pass on his title as Lord Protector to his unpopular son, motions were put in place to invite a monarchy back into the kingdom. Shortly after this, 2 events radically changed the world. London suffered the last major epidemic of the bubonic plague, killing over 100,000 people. The following year saw the Great Fire that destroyed most of the city. The call went out far and wide for masons, as Portland stone was the material chosen to rebuild London properly. When the Masons came, they brought with them their secret societies. At first meeting in taverns, they expanded to dedicated lodges as non-operative Masons joined their ranks. When most of the rebuilding was done and the workers left for their next job, many of the larger lodges remained, with artists, scientists, and nobles filling their ranks. Scientists in particular, like Isaac Newton, used these secret societies to conduct controversial experiments, searching for things like the philosopher's stone that could turn base metal into gold, and the famed elixir that could bring eternal life. They still weren't sure where the old world of magic ended and the emerging world of science began, but they didn't want their reputations to be destroyed as John Dee's had been. Newton's involvement in these controversial experiments remained a secret for hundreds of years. Over time, Freemasonry evolved and expanded to include 3 and only 3 core degrees that are still used today: Entered Apprentice, Fellowcraft, and Master Mason. Lodge meetings were an interactive ritual that included drama, props, and costumes that allowed neophytes to work their way up the ranks. The lodges created competing false histories, trying to stretch their origins back as far as they could, first to early England, then to the time of Christ, then the flood, and then Adam, and finally before the earth itself had been created. The demand for new experiences and additional knowledge resulted in numerous appendant rites, like the merit badges in scouting. Each of these borrowed segments and narratives from the core degrees, with many religious traditions having a specific appendant rite. Allegory, symbols, and history common to all lodges include the building and destruction of the Temple of Solomon, with each Masonic lodge standing as proxy for the ancient edifice. Jacob's Ladder was an important conduit whereby God, known to Masons as the grand architect of the universe, would send heavenly messengers to earth 4 times a year during the solstices and equinox. The Tree of Life was based on 3 core pillars and was a way to level up as members worked together on the prime goal of Masonry, that of making good men better. Some of the many appendant rites included ones like Royal Ark Masonry with the catchphrase, "Holiness to the Lord." Masons would learn they were like worker bees and about the importance of gathering knowledge. Masonic words like keystone, cornerstone, and arch were sprinkled heavily into the rites, as were the Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthood and the use of veils, handshakes, and secret knocks. Those given the Aaronic priesthood learned about the rod of Aaron, and the terms power of the rod, rodsman, and the power of Aaron were used synonymously. In one appendant rite, called the Elect of the Nine, Masons would role-play being one of Solomon's guards searching for an assassin. They would find him in a cave, drunk and asleep, laying next to his own sword, which they would use to behead him. At this point, you may be wondering, what does all this have to do with Mormonism? I promise you, we're almost done, and when we are, you'll see how it all fits together. Remember, I found each and every one of these stories by following clues in Lucy's book. We're now just a few years before Lucy Mack and Joseph Smith Sr. are married, and we find ourselves in Scotland. Young Robert Burns is being forced to leave for Jamaica, where he faces a sad life as a slave wrangler. On the last night presiding over his Masonic lodge, he shares a poem he wrote bidding farewell to his brethren at the St. James Lodge in Tarleton. Every Mason is thrilled to discover that they can buy an entire book of his poetry that includes other secret Masonic poems. This book can be kept out for everyone to enjoy, with only Masons knowing the hidden references. Robert sells out of the first printing, earns enough money to marry, and not only avoids the humilities waiting in Jamaica, he becomes Scotland's greatest poet. Freemasonry has now been around for several hundred years, and most no longer believe in the literal truth claims made early on. They've discovered the real alchemy of making good men better, and Burns is a shining example of this. The rise of Freemasonry has also guaranteed the widespread adoption of the King James Bible. You have the Freemasons of Scotland to thank every New Year's when you sing Bird's Auld Lang Syne. As for Robert, his farewell poem is recited in lodges all over the world, and eventually morphs into the much shortened Masonic parting, Brethren, Adieu. Across the pond lives a very special Indian. Born in a Mohegan mud hut, Samson Occam eventually converts to Scottish Presbyterianism and enters the tiny school of the great minister, Eleazar Wheelock. Eleazar has made it his life's work to create missionaries and ministers to the Indians, and thrills at the chance to teach Indians to do this themselves. Like all of Eleazar's students, Samson is given a classical education and learns Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. He learns rhetoric and scriptures and how to act like a gentleman. Inspired by Eleazar's plan to educate more Indians, the now Reverend Samson Occam answers the call to serve a 2-year fundraising mission to England. He preaches over 300 sermons there to everyone, including royalty. He is asked to stay in England but declines, feeling himself to be more at home in Scotland. He crosses Hadrian's Wall, the physical barrier between the land in the north and the south, and is dismayed at the state of the Scottish Church, where even the sermon he'd first heard from Eleazar about the sword of justice appears to fall on deaf ears. He returns with honor, having raised millions in today's money. A special fund has been set up by the Scottish Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge. They're keenly interested in methods for Christianizing heathens, as they still have murderous Druidic Highlanders causing them problems. Samson and Eleazar have a falling out when a remote site in New Hampshire is selected for the college. A few Indians near there are traditional enemies of Samson's tribe. Samson goes on to give and publish a famous execution sermon and creates his own tribe of Christian Indians in Oneida, a town about 30 miles west of Utica, New York. He never reconciles with Eleazar and dies peacefully among his people, the Brotherton Indians. Sam never sets foot on the campus he funded. His writings become the country's first Indian-authored bestseller. His sermons often include his belief that the Lord chose him, a weak thing of the world, and an Indian to bring about much righteousness. Buildings, ponds, and paths are named after him, and everyone on the campus he funded learns of his legend. Many, including famous people, thought his name was Samuel, the Indian. Eleazar names his remote college after his main benefactor, the Earl of Dartmouth. Another contributor has the charity prep school named after him. Both schools exist in the same location. They share the exact same buildings, teachers, and purpose: to turn young men into ministers and missionaries to the Indians, and to prepare them to become Freemasons. When Eleazar dies, his son John becomes the president of the college. The limited faculty includes the beloved Bezaleel Woodward, the math and philosophy professor, and the very popular and former student, Professor John Smith. Professor Johnny is adored by the students and takes on several crucial jobs, including Professor of Learned Languages, the college librarian, the minister of the college church, and the owner of the local bookstore. Professor Johnny is the cousin of both Lucy Mack Smith's mother Lydia and Joseph Smith Sr.'s father, Assail. He is also the teacher who inspired former students, including Solomon Spaulding, Ethan Smith, and Daniel Webster. He is an expert lexicographer and master of ancient languages who not only reads, writes, and speaks Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and other languages, he's a published author who has written the grammars for many of them. He is also a natural philosopher and loves to debate and reason with his students. If you were lucky enough to be a student of early Dartmouth during the decades that Professor Johnny's teachings were the core curriculum, you would attend his Church of Christ and learn about the pre-existence, about a pre-earth atonement covenant where the plan of salvation was revealed to the Father, Sons, and the sons of men, and that Christ's church exists in all ages of the earth. You would attend his School of the Prophets, where you would learn Hebrew, Greek, Latin. You would learn that spirit is a simpler form of matter and about the importance of free agency and the prosperity cycle. You would learn that there are people living on other worlds, and that light, borrowed light, and the light of reason are the things that guide us. You might attend his Masonic Arminian sermons, where you would learn that priesthood is the source of Christ's authority. You would learn about the Aaronic priesthood and the Melchizedek priesthood and how they are co-eternal with God. You would learn about degrees of glory in the eternities and about a spiritual death after the fall. You would learn that the Father argues for justice and the Son argues for mercy. As a new student, you would be encouraged to follow in the footsteps of Daniel Webster and join one of the 2 debating societies. Your dues would help fund the massive libraries used to prepare your team for the great end-of-year debates between the socials and the freighters. You would be taught correct principles and be expected to govern yourself wisely and to learn wisdom in your youth. The 2 debating society libraries placed Dartmouth in a position that far exceeded other premier religious schools of the day. The campus housed multiple poorly guarded collections of rare and valuable books on religion, philosophy, ancient languages, masonry, and more. Over 10,000 catalog titles were readily available, plus each professor had a personal library, and the small town had a well-stocked bookstore. In 1797, President Wheelock allowed Dr. Nathan Smith to join the faculty through a profit-sharing arrangement that turned Dartmouth into the 4th medical school in the United States. Dr. Nathan joined Professor Johnny and the rest of the small faculty and is remembered today mostly for his great deeds. But he was also infamous at the time for other deeds that were buried and require a little digging. Dr. Nathan Smith was living the early American dream. He had gone from poor farmer to doctor to educator, graduating from the 3rd medical school in the U.S. at Harvard and creating the 4th at Dartmouth. He went on to create other medical schools, but he kept being run out of town by angry mobs. His medical schools had a dark secret. Nathan's dilemma was that the growing country demanded good doctors. Good doctors must know anatomy, and learning anatomy required dissecting bodies. Bodies came from graves, but the public also demanded the sanctity of graves. More schools, however, meant greater demand for doctors, dissections, and bodies. There were several bad places for Nathan to get bodies. He left behind letters to other doctors asking them to procure bodies for him. There was also the time he hired the famous anatomist, Dr. Alexander Ramsay, the hunchback Scottish dwarf, but that lasted less than a year. There were students that he involved. One, Amos Twitchell, did a great job, but in 1809 another student did a lousy job and left behind his wallet at the scene of the crime. This led authorities straight back to Dartmouth, and the result was an angry mob demanding that the school be shut down. There were several good places to get bodies. The few criminals executed each year were fair game, and Nathan even wrote the governor asking him to delay an execution for months until his anatomy class was in session. With no federal law enforcement, a body procured across the river in Vermont was safe if it could be brought on campus. Likewise, bodies from New Hampshire were traded at the medical school in neighboring Vermont. The most effective means, however, was the professionals, known as the resurrectionists. These small teams had perfected their techniques, could train new recruits, and were a reliable source. As demand and risks increased with the growth of medical colleges, so did the rates, but public outcry could be kept to a minimum if you used professionals. In the highly religious era of his time, Nathan Smith learned a truth, like digging up a loved one's corpse for anatomy students to dissect, could negatively impact the faith and happiness of others, but it was still something that needed to be done. So it should be. It's just not something that you should talk about openly. Here is a fictional Help Wanted ad that shows exactly the type of professional that Nathan was looking for. Do you need money? Are you willing to bend the rules? Can you keep a secret? We need a spotter to quietly ride around locating fresh graves. We need able-bodied, quiet diggers at night. You need to have a good cover story like failed money digger, etc. We can pay you cash or kids' tuition and housing. A Mason or an Arminian preferred. No Puritans. Hiram Smith was born of goodly parents who recognized his intelligence. For the first 16 years of his life, he enjoyed the original Masonic spelling of his name, Hiram. When his family was given the opportunity to send only one of their children to an exclusive boarding school, Hiram was chosen over all his brothers, including his older brother, Alvin. In 1811, 11-year-old Hiram Smith goes off to the same boarding school that his cousin Stephen had started a year earlier. They live on campus at Dartmouth. There, Hiram studies to become a missionary to the Indians and a minister. He learns Greek, Latin, and Hebrew at a school of the prophets. He is indoctrinated with his relative John Smith's religious philosophies, attending thousands of sermons and prayers and lectures. He prepares to become a Mason and to receive the Masonic priesthood. He can attend the medical lectures of Dr. Nathan Smith, and he can watch debates among the socials and the freighters as they reason together. He has access to numerous religious libraries. At school, Hiram lives by a river in a great and spacious building. The manner of dress for his young, rich classmates and old teachers is exceedingly fine when compared with his plain clothes. His grandfather Solomon writes a religious book talking about a conversion experience where heavenly lights visited his room late at night. His uncle Jason is a charismatic cult leader. His family gets health care from Nathan Smith. His father, brother, and cousins are well diggers in a remote, isolated town that doesn't need wells. His family and Stephen's family move in together in a house owned by a Dartmouth trustee. It is this time period that Lucy recalls in her book with the famous story of Joseph's boyhood surgery. She remembers precise details and measurements about the surgery decades later, but somehow forgets that Dr. Nathan's last name is her own, Smith, and she refers to him instead as Dr. Stone. She claims that Joseph refuses to be bound or to take alcohol, but a loving parent would have required those things at that time. She claims that she sends Joseph to Uncle Jesse in Salem to recover in 1813, but she's been feuding with Jesse since 1799, and Salem at that time, why, it's still the battlefront for the War of 1812. She mentions that Hiram goes to an academy. Everything about her story implicates Dartmouth, but she won't mention it, or the infamous grave-digging Dr. Nathan by name. In Hiram's 14th year, there's great interest in the subject of religion on campus. The Dartmouth Church of Masonic Arminians is in a battle with the town of Hanover's anti-Mason Calvinist Congregationalists, which is true. There's an unprecedented outpouring of spirit among all the students. A young Levi Spalding, a relative of Solomon, feels unworthy. He retires to a secret grove to pray. Levi wonders which church to join, and he's visited by a flash of brilliant light and feels that his sins are forgiven. Levi shares this experience widely right away and only ever tells one version. He leaves for a lifelong mission to the Indians, but not the Native Americans, the actual Indians in India. Many students are inspired by young Levi, and they join the spiritual revival that spreads throughout the campus. By 1816, it's clear that Dr. Nathan Smith must go. He's perjured himself at a grave-robbing trial. His attempts to calm the town have actually converted more to strict Calvinism. These Calvinist trustees become the majority and take over the Dartmouth leadership. The Arminian theology and John Smith's teachings are buried. The ban on recruiting Masons on campus is enforced, and Nathan's own daughter dies at 15 years of age. He flees town after his last lectures. The students revolt at attempts to seize their unguarded massive libraries, and on the other side of the world, there's a catastrophe as Mount Tambora blows up. Old Dartmouth is dead. At the same time, the Smith family is warned out of Norwich. They're kicked out of the Dartmouth trustee's house along with the Mack family. Hiram is yanked from school 1 year before he graduates, and Stephen, who has just graduated, goes with them. For 20 years, they've only moved back and forth 5 to 20 miles in a tight little circle and always near family. Yet this time, Joseph Sr. leaves with massive debts and goes 300 miles away. The older boys follow, and then Lucy. She cheats the driver at Oneida, just west of Utica, and in her manuscript just forgets to mention that this is the name of the famous town of Occam's Brotherhood Indians. The family reunites in Palmyra with only a small portion of their effects and, according to Lucy, 2 cents to their name. Shortly after arriving in a new town with no connections, Joseph Sr. borrows money for horses. Hiram gets a new alias, Hyrum. His name is changed from Masonic to Biblical years before the Morgan affair. Lucy acquires a cake and beer shop on Main Street and has young Joseph peddle her wares, mainly at revivals. The family is able to buy land, build homes, and thrive, while many in the rest of the world starve and die. After 11 months, Joseph Sr. sues instead of paying for the horses and requests a Masonic jury. His prior Masonic blackball should preclude him from joining a lodge, yet Alvin, Joseph Sr., and Hiram all become Freemasons, at different lodges. They keep digging for money for the next 15 years, but they never ever find any. And many neighbors later testify that they simply don't know how the Smith family earns money. Meanwhile, back east, many rare and expensive books have gone missing from Dartmouth. There's no Scotichronicon to be found anywhere on campus. It's strange that a college founded as a Scottish religious institution does not have the Scottish religious history book. Harvard has one, but that would be like a Book of Mormon being found at Notre Dame, but not at BYU. Nathan moves on to Yale to form his next medical school. He prefers to get his corpses from secret suppliers. More medical schools continue to pop up everywhere. The demand for dead bodies explodes. It's supplied from well-organized teams, yet no one, ever, claims credit. Following the pattern of the Old Testament Joseph, the Smith family first goes through 7 fat years in New York. The multi-talented clan enjoys the fruits of 3 Freemasons, 3 conjurers, 3 Presbyterians. 6 of them have a basic education. 2, the parents, have a good education, and 1, Hiram, has an excellent education far exceeding the others. Lucy has become a midwife, and at least 3 family members have become failed money diggers. During this time, the family not only survives, somehow they thrive. After that, the future doesn't look so bright. The Smith family's luck changes completely overnight, and tragedy strikes when Alvin dies, kicking off 7 lean years. The family advertises in the local newspaper that they've camped in the graveyard with Alvin's body for 5 weeks, just in case someone tries to rob it. Even though the younger boys are now as old as Alvin was when they first moved into town, any honest labor that is being done just isn't enough to pay the bills. Mounting debts soar. 2 possible Smith benefactors, Nathan Smith and Stephen Mack, grow old and die. The family loses their large home. They need some new plan, or total financial ruin lies just ahead. A quick inventory of the resources of the most capable Smiths show they have a veritable dream team of talent. Joseph Sr. and Lucy, the directors, have a good solid education. He's a Freemason with connections, and she's a church-going Presbyterian popular among her congregation. He's a conjurer and failed money digger, but also has a talent as a writer, which will be shown later when he starts selling patriarchal blessings. Lucy is a capable midwife, and she also is an author, as shown by the 300-page book she'll create 15 years later. Hiram, the writer, has both the benefits of a lodge of Freemason brethren and the same church congregation his mom goes to. He also has been a failed money digger, but his authoring capability